Experiments recently conducted by Merle Lawrence and Adelbert Ames in Adelbert's laboratory in Hanover, New Hampshire, prove that what you see when you look at something depends not so much on what there is, as on the assumption you make when you look. Since what we believe to be the real physical world is actually only an assumptive world, it is not surprising that these experiments prove that what appears to be solid is actually the result of expectations or assumptions. Your assumptions determine not only what you see, but also what you do, for they govern all your conscious and subconscious movements towards the fulfillment of themselves. Over a century ago, this truth was stated by Emerson as follows: "As the world was plastic and fluid in the hands of God, so it is ever to so much of his attributes as we bring to it. To ignorance and sin, it is flint. They adapt themselves to it as they may, but in proportion as a man has anything in him divine, the firmament flows before him and takes his signet and form." Your assumption is the hand of God that is molding the firmament into the image of that which you assume. The assumption of the wish fulfilled is the high tide which lifts you easily off the bar of the senses where you have long lain stranded. It lifts the mind into prophecy in the full right sense of the word, and if you have that controlled imagination and absorbed attention which it is possible to attain, you may be sure that all your assumption applies will come to pass. When William Blake wrote, "What seems to be is to those to whom it seems to be," he was only repeating the eternal truth, that there is nothing unclean of itself, but to him that esteems anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. Romans chapter 14 and verse 14. Because there is nothing unclean of itself, or clean of itself, you should assume the best and think of only that which is lovely and of good report. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. It is not superior insight, but ignorance of this law of assumption. If you read into the greatness of men some littleness which you may be familiar, or into some situation or circumstance an unfavorable conviction. Your particular relationship to another influences your assumption with respect to that other and makes you see in him that which you do see. If you can change your opinion of another, then what you now believe of him cannot be absolutely true, but is only relatively true. The following is an actual case history illustrating how the law of assumption works. One day, a costume designer described to me her difficulties in working with a prominent theatrical producer. She was convinced that he unjustly criticized and rejected her best work and that often he was deliberately rude and unfair to her. Upon hearing her story, I explained that if she found the other rude and unfair, it was a sure sign that she herself was wanting and that it was not the producer, but herself that was in need of a new attitude. I told her that the power of this law of assumption and its practical application could be discovered only through experience, and that only by assuming that the situation was already what she wanted, could she prove that she could bring about the change desired. Her employer was merely bearing witness, telling her by his behavior what her concept of him was. I suggested that it was quite probable that she was carrying on conversations with him in her mind which were filled with criticism and recriminations. There was no doubt but that she was mentally arguing with the producer, for others only echo that which we whisper to them in secret. I asked her if it was not true that she talked to him mentally, and if so, what those conversations were like. She confessed that every morning on her way to the theater, she told him just what she thought of him in a way that she would never have dared address him in person. The intensity and force of her mental arguments with him automatically established his behavior towards her. She began to realize that all of us carry on mental conversations, but, unfortunately, on most occasions, these conversations are argumentative. That we have only to observe the passerby on the street to prove this assertion, that so many people are mentally engrossed in conversation and few appear to be happy about it. But the very intensity of their feeling must lead them quickly to the unpleasant incident they themselves have mentally created and therefore now must encounter. What she had realized she had been doing, she agreed to change her attitude and to live this law faithfully by assuming her job was highly satisfactory and her relationship with the producer was a very happy one. To do this, she agreed that before going to sleep at night, on her way to work and at other intervals during the day, she would imagine that she had congratulated her on her fine designs and that she, in turn, had thanked him for his praise and kindness. To her great delight, she soon discovered for herself that her own attitude was the cause of all that befell her. The employer actually miraculously reversed his own behavior, his attitude echoing, as it has always done, that which she assumed now reflected her changed concept of him. What she did was by the power of her imagination. Her persistent assumption influenced his behavior and determined his attitude toward her. With the passport of desire on the wings of a controlled imagination, she traveled into the future of her own predetermined experience. Thus, we see it as not facts, but that which we create in our imagination, which shapes our lives, for most of the conflicts of the day are due to the want of a little imagination to cast the beam out of our own eye. It is the exact and literal-minded who live in a fictitious world. As this designer, by her controlled imagination, started the subtle change in her employer's mind, so can we, by the control of our imagination and wisely directed feeling, solve our problems. By the intensity of her imagination and feeling, the designer cast a kind of enchantment on her producer's mind, and caused him to think that his generous praise originated with him. Often our most elaborate and original thoughts are determined by another. We should never be certain that it was not some woman treading in the winepress who began the subtle change in men's mind, or that the passion did not begin in the mind of some shepherd boy lighting up his eyes for a moment before it ran upon its way. William Butler Yeats. You know, this chapter reminds me of the statement, and I actually posted it on our Twitter the other day. It's not your aptitude, but your attitude that determines your altitude, right? It's not how smart you are or how qualified you are or anything like that. It's your attitude. It's your mental attitude. It's the conversations you have with yourself. It's the assumptions and expectations that you're carrying throughout the day. Because your assumptions, they don't just determine what you see, but they also determine what they do, because they govern all of your conscious and subconscious movements toward the fulfillment of themselves, right? So what happens here is everything we do is done and thought and seen and felt through the lens of assumption. So if an assumption is a container, ideas and thoughts and inner dialogue and feelings are what's inside the container, right? What happens when you change the container itself, you change what's inside of it. When you change the container from being poor to being abundant, all of a sudden, you start getting ideas that can produce money. You start getting, you start meeting people that have money and want to invest in something that you're doing. You know, there are so many different scenarios and ways that plays out, but everything you do is filtered through the lens of your assumption and your expectation. And your assumption is the divine hand molding your world into the image of what you're assuming to be true. I love when Neville talks about William Blake. What seems to be is to those to whom it seems to be, right? I love that statement because what he's saying in modern speak is the way it is the way it is for the person that says that's the way it is. And so we find here that if our opinion of the world can change, then what we believe of the world cannot be absolutely true, but is only relatively true, right? If what we believe about a person can change, then what we now believe cannot be absolutely true, but is only relatively true. And this is the really amazing thing, because the minute we assume or we believe something that's polar opposite of what we have been believing or assuming to be true, we find that the world begins to unravel itself from that place, from that point of assumption. I love reading the story of the costume designer that, is criticized by her boss and wants to just scream at him and tell him all these things, and I get it, I was just thinking about, some situations going on in my life the other day where somebody is, arguing and being somewhat disrespectful to somebody that I really care about. And I said to myself, well, I could go give them a talking to and say, hey, I don't appreciate the way you're talking to this person, right? Or I could choose to imagine something new. I could choose to imagine that the debates and the debacles and the arguments weren't even happening in the first place. And this is where it really gets powerful. This is where we really begin to see that this law applies to absolutely everything. And I want you to take a look at I want you to think for a second about a certain thing that's going on in your life and you find it going on over and over and over and over and over again. I want you to take some inventory today, and as we move on to the next couple chapters and finish this book out, of what your mental conversations are around the subject that you're unpleased of. Because I'll tell you what, our life, our experiences, our businesses, our relationships, our careers, our jobs, our families, the experiences that we have with all of these things is completely shaped by our assumption around it. It's completely shaped ultimately around our assumption about ourselves, what we believe about ourselves, because what we believe about ourselves ultimately becomes everything that we think and do, right? So if we believe ourselves to be unworthy or undeserving, we'll probably show, signs of self-sabotage in relationships, and we may not even know it, right? We may do things to cripple a situation unconsciously simply because that's exactly what we believe to be true. And this is where so many of us get stuck in these cycles that we just don't understand. And it's because we're not aware of what the deeper assumption is around the cycle itself. So if you're in the middle of some sort of adversity, if you're in a place that you feel is toxic, if you are in a relationship that you feel is toxic, if you're in some sort of situation that is unpleasant, before you up and leave, my recommendation to you would be to simply examine what your own state of consciousness is around the situation. What is the content of the container? What is the content of the container, the mental conversations? And as you begin to look at that, you're going to be like, holy crap, it makes so much sense. This single belief spawned an infinite amount of thoughts, feelings, actions, and ultimately results, right? And I love, when the costume designer finally discovers that her own attitude was the cause of everything that befell her. The behavior of the employer miraculously reversed itself. And I think that's so cool. And if you take this law literally, you'll find that the world really does exist in accordance and relative to your to your assumption. And what she did was by the power of her imagination, her persistent assumption influenced his behavior and determined his attitude towards her. But here's the thing. The reason this worked was because she crowded all other ideas out of consciousness. She consumed herself with the feeling of the wish fulfilled, of the employer already treating her the way she wants to be treated, being talked to, being praised, right? So how often do we complain about something that if we just changed our imaginal activity around the thing, our experience in regards to that thing would totally change? Because our experiences won't change until we do. Our experiences will not change until we change ourselves. By the intensity of her imagination and feeling, the designer cast a kind of enchantment on her producer's mind and caused him to think that his generous praise originated with him. This is what's really amazing. We're all connected. This connectedness is real because who you really are is imagination. And if who you really are is imagination, you are everybody. You are everything. You're not separate from anything. Absolutely anything. And everything that is, every form of matter is a manifestation of this same imagination. And so if you really take that and you listen to it and you let it sit inside of your soul, let that marinate, that all forms of matter can be likened to a pop-up book, and you open the page and the things sprout up on the page. Even though all these things are positioned on different parts of the page, they're still very much the page. They're just portions of the page twisted and shaped in different forms. And that's exactly what's going on here with this human experience is that you are imagination. You don't use your imagination. You are imagination. And the world is the echo chamber. The world is the manifestation of imaginal activity. And if the entire world focused, if each of us made it our sole duty to gain imaginal mastery, thinking only the thoughts wanted, the feelings wanted, the situations wanted, as much as absolutely possible, you'd find little to no resistance in your life, and everything that you'd ever dreamed about would exist. Because it's an outpicturing. The world's an outpicturing. It's an outshelf. It's a outcropping of a pre-existing seed, which is your state of consciousness. If your state of consciousness is a seed, your experiences in the world are the blossomed plant, the final form. And if you take that seed and you direct it, and you persist in that direction, you will find the world shifts as easily as a lump of clay. See, we don't need to add all these different techniques into our lives. We need to remove everything in us that is contrary to the truth that we are all imagination, that we are 100% divine imaginal beings with infinite potential, infinite power, worthy, love, deserving. See, most people's problem is not that they don't feel it real enough. It's that their assumption has not shifted despite them trying to think a new thought. You have to shift the assumption. And new thoughts come as a byproduct. We want to generate a bunch of new thoughts. Well, here's how to do that. Change your assumption about yourself. Change your assumption about the world. Change your assumption about yourself in relation to the world, and you will find that the quality of ideas that come into your mind and the act that you produce results with completely changes relative to what it was before you started. I dare you. Take this and test it. Run with it. You are all imagination. Infinity is literally bursting from your fingertips. You are fully capable of deciding your own destiny. Talk soon.